fantastic lineup of speakers this evening. I'm not going to introduce them because I'm going to leave that to Amelia, who's going to introduce them in turn. So without further ado, can you please join me in giving them a massive round of applause?
Thank you all for being here. Sounds like you were all having a very good time sharing your hopes, I hope, and not so many fears, although it's a fearful kind of a world we're in. But anyway, we're going to try and make sense of it. And to do that, we have some of the sharpest minds and biggest hearts, I think, around. And first is Farhana Yaman, who's sitting next to me here, who's, as they say, internationally renowned. She's been at this for 3 decades. She's glued herself to things. She's been on the inside at Shell. She's been on the outside of police stations, but also the inside and outside of government process. And so she's a development policy expert. She's advised leaders and ministers on the climate negotiations. She was integrally involved in the Paris Agreement. She has a long list of associate fellowships.
And obviously started very young.
And she's currently coordinating the Culture COP, which is a new initiative to bring the arts and creative sector together. And then we have the token male, as he's pointed out here, is Mark Maslin. He's a professor of Earth System Science at UCL. He's a leading scientist. He's got a fantastic book out, actually. Several books, but How to Save Our Planet was the most recent one, hopefully hot off the shelves. And he's a scientist with particular expertise in understanding the Anthropocene. It was a quiz question once that I was, what age are we in? And how it relates to the challenges facing us in the 21st century. He's published 150 papers in all sorts of prestigious journals. Medical and science journals. And then we have Clover Hogan, who's a climate activist and a researcher. I didn't know she was an Australian, but she is. You won't be able to tell from her accent. She focuses on eco-anxiety and is the founding executive director of Force of Nature, a youth non-profit that mobilises for climate action and will be present at COP, not Clover herself, but lots of people from Force of Nature. And she's worked alongside the leading authorities on sustainability and consulted within the boardrooms of companies. It's good that they have you in, and supported students in 50 countries. And on the screen we have, last but not least, Nyendo Machua Muniu. I'm sorry if I made a mess of that. My name's not much easier to pronounce. And she's the communications officer at the Stockholm Environmental Institute, where she supports projects focusing on translating science to policy and practice in agriculture. And before that, worked for the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa. Thank you all for being here. And I'm going to start with Farhana. I've warned her that I will start with her, just because she can give us a good perspective, I think, over the years and where we are. And are we, Farhana, in a better or worse position than you expected at the time of the Paris Agreement, which, it seems like a long time ago now, I'm sure.
Well, thank you. I think it's a very difficult time. Hi there, is that better?
Better.
So it's a very difficult time, and I guess I want to not say the glass is half full, we're better on this and worse on that. I think in some we're in jeopardy, we're in real crisis, and I think in Paris we had a lot more optimism and a defined pathway and a sort of structure that we'd created, and maybe now I look back and think falsely believed in that it would kind of deliver, even against some sort of trepidations that it may not. So we'd created the ratchet mechanisms, we'd got 1.5, the reference in, we'd got an agreement that parties would review, in fact, their ambition before 2020. And so that led to this thing called the Tallowa dialogues, which then just turned out to be dialogues. We got the loss and damage in provisions, and that has also not led to enough action. So I feel honestly right now, last week, about 8 reports came out from UN bodies or from very authoritative, the UNFCCC, assessing the State of the World by WRI, many, many others that I can, WHO, there was, UNEP, the whole lot of them. And every single one of them is, a sort of badge of shame on us all. So I think the multilateral process is hanging in there as the one source of optimism in creating a structure to hold those accountable who have led us to this point where we have not accelerated and in fact we've gone backwards. So that's why I'm going to COP this time with that accountability function really at the forefront. And I think that's why there's this clamour to be there, especially by people who are at the receiving end of climate impacts, but also the social and ecological breakdown that we're seeing as a result of, frankly, a not fit for purpose economic system which has caused all of these impacts.
And actually, Clever, I'll ask you, what did you think this COP would be about? As you're preparing for it.
Well, there were a lot of problems with COP26 in Glasgow last year, but I didn't find hope in the closed-door rooms where decisions are being made that ultimately govern our future, made by people who probably won't live long enough to actually witness their consequences. But I did find hope in the streets. I found hope in the hundreds of thousands of people galvanizing and mobilizing. The absolute highlight for me was this community space that we held at Force of Nature, where we invited activists from around the world to just come together in solidarity and actually just check in on a really human, vulnerable level about what it is to carry the weight of this. And so it was really that civil society engagement. And unfortunately, this year with COP happening in a literal resort town in Egypt, where the prices of accommodation and travel and everything have been so exclusionary, and naturally in a country where it's very dangerous to be an activist and to be outspoken, we're not going to see that civil disobedience. It's seriously dangerous for activists to speak out in that way. And I've kind of heard word of, we're creating this designated tent over here for the activists to hang out in. So I'm not feeling very hopeful about this. And it's so sad because, you look at the continent of Africa, and it's like, many countries in the global south composed of communities who have contributed least to the climate crisis and are already experiencing its worst impacts. For them, the climate crisis isn't something happening in 2050 when we're talking about 1 billion climate refugees. It's something that is already impacting hundreds of millions of people. And so it feels like a real missed opportunity. And so everything that we've been doing at Force of Nature, knowing that there's going to be a disproportionate representation of people who look like me from privileged backgrounds, is making sure that those from most affected areas are in those spaces and are not just tokenized, being put on panels, but are actually part of the decision making.
I had the benefit in Glasgow of seeing Patti Smith singing with Vanessa Nakate on a stage and going to protests and marches, and it was a very positive atmosphere, you're right. And so it does seem like we won't have that this year. Mark, you went to Glasgow. Are we where you thought we would be a year later? Of course, we've had enormous upheaval in the world, which has changed the playing field all around. But we've also had some good things. We've had elections, we've had some political movement.
So I think we have to think of Glasgow like Paris. It was a moment in time. And what was interesting is because it had 2 years to prepare and to actually negotiate. And I think what people don't realize is the outcomes of these negotiations are not done in those 2 weeks. They're done in these sort of years beforehand leading up to that. And you can actually see step-like changes all the way through the year. The Egyptians haven't been as engaged as other organizers. They're seeing this more as an event apart from a negotiation, which is, I think, unfortunate. Whereas Dubai is already starting the negotiations for the next one. So they're already starting to negotiate with countries for COP28. So that's what you have to have. So I think that's unfortunate. It's unfortunate as well because the COP is usually 4 COPs in one. So we always talk about the negotiations. So those are the countries. Then you have the pavilions, and you have the people in the green zone. Those are NGOs, those are activists, those are observers, big international organizations like the World Bank. They all show off what they're doing, and there's lots of really interesting interactions between them and the negotiators. And then outside COP, you usually have this huge commercial business NGO space where lots of places are booked. Now that's happening in Egypt. I know that lots of organizations are organizing to have particular hotels. Though I have to say one person almost pushed the button to pay for a hotel, which he realized there was a slight spelling mistake in the a website, because of course it'd been cloned. So you have to be a bit careful there as well. But again, what I think is the great shame is civil society came out in Glasgow. I mean, I remember on the Friday being so proud of seeing young people out there, led by, of course, Greta, walking down the streets, and I thought this was huge. Oh, I was so wrong. On Saturday, it felt like everybody in Scotland had come out, because I stood at one corner and just watched the actual protest go by again and again.
Hour after hour.
Happen.
Yeah.
That won't happen. So I think what we need to have happen at this COP is to make sure that there is small incremental progress in certain things. It would be fantastic if we can get loss and damage agreed. That will be beholden on the EU, the UK, and USA. Everybody else has agreed. It's just they, on the Saturday in Glasgow, went, no. And so basically, literally, it was a couple of people, John Kerry, and, oh, sorry, I've named him out loud, who basically went, no, we're not having that. And so therefore, it's influencing those people to try and actually get them to say yes at that point. There are other things, trying to actually get countries to boost their pledges to actually increase it. But I will say one positive thing. If we were sitting here 10 years ago, we would be worried about a 4 to 5 degrees apocalyptic warning by the end of the century. Now, if the climate policies currently work, then we're looking at about, say, 3 to 3.5. If countries do what they promised at Glasgow, then we're looking at, say, 2.4 to 2.8. Now, that's nowhere near the 1.5 degrees, and we've already seen what happens at 1.2 degrees in the last 2 years. But it is a massive change from where we were 10 years ago. So a little bit of optimism, but yeah, don't hold out too much hope for Egypt.
I'll come back to you on the science of warming in a minute. Nyendo, can I ask you, do you have any hope, at least based on the fact that it's as they're calling it, an African COP? I've also heard it called an implementation COP, which is not nearly as exciting. So in that there will be a strong African presence, and there will be at least a semblance of diversity that we might not have had otherwise if it was located somewhere else. Is there some hope in that?
I think there's some hope in that. It's happening on African soil. I wouldn't really call it an African COP. It's just happening on African soil. But, African leaders are coming well represented. There are different sort of coalitions that are put together, different reports that are coming together to present them at COP, just presenting what they need and what they see fit for the African context in the different countries or the different regional blocks. So there is hope in that. The only hope I have is that the people who are affected most by the climate vulnerability, that their voices will be heard. I know COP is a place for negotiating and a lot of legal jargon and political discussions, but there's a voice that is lacking there. And I'm hoping that the African leaders really come through on that and that their voice will be heard. There's this, I don't know what to call it, but there's an assumption that it's just Africans who are sort of suffering, but there are other nations that are suffering, but that is happening on African soil. I'm hoping these voices can come together and really have a united front at this COP.
Will you be there? Will you be at this COP?
No, I have never been to any COP, and I'm not going for this COP. My focus is always the before and the after. I have this fear of attending. When you attend so many conferences, they all start sounding the same, like talk shops. So I really manage my own expectations for my own heart and my own peace. I just wait for the outcomes and the discussions as opposed to being there.
And how do you think, Vahana, we can show progress at a COP? Is there... At this one, how is it when there's no sort of well, particularly this one, it's about implementation. You will be monitoring, as you say, that's useful, and also civil society groups, and just to have some level of outside influence, I think, will be helpful. But you tell me, what do you think we can?
I think you know, there are many layers of COP. COP is the legal heart of the intergovernmental process. And so there isn't a huge amount left over from the sort of 5-year round of stuff that we had to complete, in essence, the Paris rule book, the Paris guidebook. We have done most of that. There's still some issues. So what we have to do is deliver the actual reductions. We have to deliver the money. We have to deliver a different system of finance. We have to deliver on the promises that were made for the vulnerable countries and for protecting people who are now absolutely in harm's way and who are desperate. You know, just a few hundred miles from Sharm el-Sheikh, the Horn of Africa, you know, millions of people are literally on the verge of starvation. They've already slaughtered most of their assets in terms of their livelihoods, their cattle, their, you know, those are running into hundreds of millions of people. It's not just Pakistan, the country that I'm from, which is still underwater, by the way, and hasn't even started its reconstruction yet, which is off the agenda for most people. So the delivery has to match. And I think sometimes the COP process is weak at that. So that's why it was good that many people tried to frame it as the implementation COP, the delivery COP. And that's why, on balance, it is good that, you know, almost 100 leaders are coming, including that they've had to be dragged, you know, as our Prime Minister, who's still technically the head, we're still the presidency. The presidency actually legally only changes hands on the first day after the successful election. So it's kind of astounding. So I think there are many metrics of success, but the one thing to look for is a simple word, you know, establish. This COP has to establish the loss and damage, financial arrangements, facility, mechanism, you can call it what you like, but that word has to come out, I think, for people to feel that politicians, policymakers, and that this process works, and that we won't be fobbed off again by having to sympathise with a very difficult point in the US electoral cycle. You know, for most of us, we use up most of our sympathy not on people who are bearing the impacts of droughts and floods, but actually on our sympathy goes with the floodgates of litigation. That is what the US raises continually. That is what John Kerry raises continually. He's talked slightly different words and toned down things. I understand it may be his last COP. And there's a legacy issue, but you know, he's worrying about his legacy. Everyone's worrying about their lives and what will happen. And this is the incongruence of the expectations and what is really at stake. So I think this COP has to make that progress. I think there has to be, from corporations, the private sector, from foundations, from NGOs, that commitment that they will not leave the vulnerables behind, that no one will be left behind. That's the sustainable goal objective. And this COP has to, you know, do something really heroic. And if it doesn't do that, it will, I think, be a disappointment. And it could quite possibly be a train wreck in terms of diplomacy.
So at the heart of this debate that you're talking about with John Kerry, it shouldn't really be a debate, but anyway, it's a long, never-ending discussion about loss and damage, is the question of who will pay, right? And more recently, I've heard that even China is worried about loss and damage because it doesn't want to, down the track, as the current biggest emitter, have to compensate poorer countries. So this who will pay thing, Mark, is it enough to just have language that recognises, you know, that acknowledges the fact of loss and damage without a sort of further commitment? I've heard people say, well, we just want recognition that it's owed, that something is owed.
Can I just say, in Paris, we did that negotiation. So we ended up spending, like, honestly,
Yeah.
Emily, a decade to get an article on loss and damage. We then spent the last 3 nights, including going into overtime, on excluding liability and compensation, which is sort of tucked in. So
Who pays?
it's not like we haven't had time to look at these big picture questions. And the vulnerables that I acted for were like, okay, as long as support comes and there is recognition, we don't care what you call it. Some people do, and that's great, and it would rather be on the basis of climate justice than a little bit of tinkering about. But let's at least acknowledge that we have to put something on the table as opposed to nothing. So, sorry I had to intervene, but
that's
it's not
very
like
useful,
we haven't been
useful
discussing this for
perspective.
10 years already.
Yeah.
And it's time to move forward, and as a gesture, frankly, of goodwill and solidarity and diplomacy, that is what the developed countries must do. And not blocking the agenda item would be a start, but actually putting money on the table and saying, here is the support. Let's work out how the financial system, the humanitarian system, the aid system now works to solve this complicated set of issues, because they're solvable.
I was looking at the agenda for the World Leaders' Days, although Joe Biden won't be there till the end after the US midterm elections at the end of the first week. But those 2 key Leaders' Days, Mark, don't really have anything to do with paying for anything on there. They've got food security, which is important, obviously, and other key issues, but not that.
So I hate to start off this with a quote from Tom Cruise, but it really is, show me the money. I mean, we've had all the nice words, we've had all this, we've had a pledge by the developed world that they were going to produce 100 billion. That was in 2009, ratified in 2010, and it still hasn't turned up. Even if you massage the figures and you get sort of like PR companies, you still don't make 100 billion, okay? Which is change, okay? It's short change at the back of the sofa for the developed world. And so I think this is where we have an issue, which is this lack of trust. A trust between countries, particularly between the developed and the developing world. Because the developed countries come, they say nice things, they say, yeah, and then they don't do it. And actually, it would be nice, it'd be just nice for once to go to a COP and somebody go, yeah, here you are, here's the money. And everybody go, oh, thank God for that. Right, we can move on to the next thing. Because actually, if you think about it, it's a historic legacy. We have been extracting resources, we've been extracting labor, we've been extracting wealth from these countries for hundreds of years. And in doing so, pumping CO2 into the atmosphere, and basically, guess what? Changing the climate, making their life worse. But we don't acknowledge that. And we never acknowledge that. I mean, it's partly because we don't teach it properly in many of our countries. We don't teach that history of our colonial legacy, our empire, our oppression of people around the world. If we actually did, perhaps we'd step back and go, hang on, perhaps we should be a little bit fairer. And I think that's where we need to get to. This COP being the African COP, even though I know we shouldn't necessarily call it the African COP, it's a really good way of saying, look, let's focus on a particular region. We are talking about adaptation, so adaptation is being given equal status with reducing emissions at this COP because people are already suffering. So therefore, I go back to awful as a child of the 80s. Yeah, Tom Cruise, show us the money.
So clever. How are the activists going to be able to extract some of this money?
Breaking into their houses. I think the first thing I wanted to say was just so many of the so-called climate solutions that are at the center of global discourse are modern day colonization. Like they're recreating the very systems of oppression and commodification of nature, exploitation of frontline communities that have created the same crisis. Like if I hear about one more carbon capture technology that isn't just a tree, like I'm actually gonna bang my head against a wall. And you know, John Kerry, to bring him back into the conversation, exemplifies this perfectly. Like ahead of last COP, he literally said over 50% of the technologies needed to reach net zero have not yet been invented. Like that is absolute bull. We've had the resources, technology, ingenuity to solve this crisis for years, for decades, and to pretend that this is anything but a choice and a lack of political will is a complete delusion. And I'm also just quite irritated by how we keep talking about like 33 million people being displaced or 1.5 million people in Nigeria, being underwater. We keep framing these as like accidental things when this is a choice. Like, we're choosing to sacrifice people, right? And you have to sit with like the pain and the grief of that, right? Because it's incredibly heavy and it's heartbreaking that we're capable of being so immoral. And to pretend that these systems don't bring out anything but greed and selfishness, again, is just a delusion. So it's what gives me hope is this generation's capacity and ability to see outside of this incumbent system and radically reimagine so much of how we're living today. But for me, anything that is not transformational should not even be put on the table. I show up into so many climate conversations in the context of business, which is how do we make more money out of the system? Deborah Berman from the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty put it really well, which is that every oil company wants to be the last company to extract the last barrel of oil. So why do we keep giving oil and gas a seat at the table? Why do we even invite them into the room?
So when you go to see the people with the money, the private money anyway, as opposed to public money, which is ours actually, what do they say about why they haven't acted on carbon capture that oil companies could have done? It's very expensive. They could have invested in it, but they haven't. They've waited, in fact, for the American taxpayer to subsidise carbon capture, which is what's going to happen in the next couple of years, to sort of deal with the fact that they're going to continue producing oil and gas.
Well, you see a lot of mental gymnastics, which is, them trying to justify why they do what they do, and different, maybe more insidious versions of denial beyond just outright this isn't happening, which is like techno-utopianism. Yeah, this is something that we can solve with a new technological advancement, rather than going to the heart of capitalism. So, there's something really interesting psychologically that goes on, but what's fascinating to me is that the most effective way to kind of cut through that is to talk about legacy and to talk about the world that they're handing over to their children. And oftentimes they're having that conversation with us not because they read the IPCC report or because they went to COP, but because their kid came home to them at the end of the day and asked, Mom, Dad, what are you doing about the climate crisis? And I think a lot of them have been ensnared within this economic model in this system where they've said, I have to provide for my family, I have to, hand over money and legacy to the next generation, whatever. And it's like, yeah, and you're handing over a planet on fire, right? And so I think that is where you can achieve the real kind of heart and mind shifts. Mm-hmm. But yeah, we're just like continually deluding ourselves and thinking that we're going to solve this crisis with the same people and the same types of thinking that created it.
Well, the chief executive of ExxonMobil has just had grandchildren, but he still lives in Houston and still is pumping oil madly, so I don't think that's helped really the legacy issue. Nyando, I want to ask, is something that we could do with fossil fuel subsidies, is there something there that, practically speaking, I think the Stockholm Institute has looked at that?
But I can't really speak to that now because I'm not part of the team that deals with that. But I'll speak to something that we touched on earlier about loss and damage. Mm-hmm. And just a quick plug is that the Stockholm Environment Institute just yesterday released a report dubbed Operationalizing Finance for Loss and Damage from Principles to Modalities. Because for so long we've talked about loss and damage and how I think it's like a topic that people do not want to discuss because it comes with liability and responsibilities, and developed countries don't want to really discuss it because it's just a weighty issue. And I like how Mark has put it, like we've taken so much from these developing countries, and the least that the developed countries can do is to give climate financing, is to finance how these countries are going to come out of this, how they're going to adapt to these climate changes. So the report touches on how, the accessibility, the recipient ownership, transparency, And then now that builds a trust that has been lost between the developed and the developing countries. Yeah.
Do you think, is the COP process working for that? Do you think that it's fit for purpose?
I don't know how to answer that question. I feel like some voices are louder than others, or some are like shuttered down, like not to be too loud. But I want to trust the process. I really do. But what comes out of it is just pledges and recommitments. I mean, there's some words that I hear and I shudder, like double down and we are repledging and recommitting. I'm like, if you made a promise in the first place, let's start with that promise. Let's not go back to recommitments. Stick to your words. So the process, I think it's flawed, in my opinion, because there's nothing concrete that comes out of it. There's no accountability mechanism for this to be the developing countries. So I'm not entirely sure what happens. Maybe I need to attend a COP to actually see for myself what happens.
Shed some light on how it goes.
Look, the older present-day version of me versus the person who started 30 plus years ago, I think the COP now is a huge experiment in a very different type of global governance, and that's why people come to it. And they also see that climate change isn't a problem that you kind of fix, you know, with one technology or a carbon tax or a bit of trading here and there. And we did, you know, I say that in a few sentences, but that understanding's taken like 2 decades. So what we now have is a set of gatherings and an intention to create and re-engineer, reset the entire global economy and transform the values on which it sits. So there's a part of me that is so proud of this process, and so much has been achieved from it, and very little other processes match what we've done. And that's absolutely thrilling, and the reason why I'll still be, just got my visa here and, you know, be going. And at the same time, I also want to say to especially the younger activists, to those who have joined recently, you know, you're joining, that's the struggle that you're joining. You're not joining something that is going to have a fixed, you know, end point.
Right.
Most of the struggles that have inspired, you know, people like Vanessa, people like Greta now are, you know, the suffragettes movement, the anti-apartheid movement, the gay rights movement, the movements for respect and dignity for animals, human rights. You know, these have taken hundreds of years. The labor rights movement, you know, labor, you know, and trade unions. So these have taken an incredibly long time. Democracy itself, which is why this COP is especially difficult, frankly, is taken a long time. And so actually in 30 years, we're not doing too badly. You know, when I look at my reflective, what have we done? What is my own personal legacy? And the good news is the economic facts are pulling the rug out from the incumbents. They have nothing to stand on because the new technologies are cheaper. It's possible for us now to deliver the new energy. The new solutions are cheaper and better and healthier all round. And that is why they need to capture political power. That is why they need the billions in lobbying. That is why they need to greenwash. That is why they need subsidies. That is why they need to win elections. It's literally to control the mechanisms of power, because that reality is now glaringly obvious to everyone. And we have to help them get out of the way through hook and crook and by force and direct action, civil disobedience. That's what I'm experimenting with. And I guess finally, you know, the initiative that I'm experimenting and pioneering with, you know, hundreds of others is called Culture COP. And it's an attempt really to create different kinds of gatherings where we look at toxic values and we imagine a better future, and where we reinvent our relationships to each other and to the natural world and to the economy. And that's not possible in our polities very much, actually. So that's why the role of imagination, creatives, the way in which arts, heritage, culture gives us permission to be more imaginative is needed, because people are browbeaten in the existing system and they can't control the existing political system. You know, it's taken over by billionaires and the elites. So I feel like I've gone back to my 18-year-old self, actually, and very happy with that. And I feel I have 4 kids, and I don't want to leave them this planet, and don't want to have all of them, you know, fearing for their future and fearing that they can't take part in the things that they would love to do. So yeah, I'm willing to take lots more risk, including at Egypt, which, as I said, is made more difficult finally by the fact, and this, I'm going to end it there. I think it's asked very many challenging, you know, conditions about who gets to host a COP. I think that's one of the big things that everyone is asking, rightly so. You know, it's not just about offering hotel rooms. It's not just about offering, you know, cheap flights from around the world. This is about the integrity of the process, which should be open, transparent, accessible to all. And a country that is, you know, so hostile to its own civil liberties and to its own environmental NGOs, I wonder if that's something we want to follow in the future. And this COP is showing us the constraints of that. So we have an especially important job to do, those of us who can raise their voices. My visa's probably being cancelled, it must be.
I'm going to ask you about UAE shortly, which is the next location for COP, which I'm more nervous about, if possible. Mark, so the UN does have it's not a complete, I feel sorry sometimes for the Secretary-General. I feel like he needs psychological counselling, because he's forever ringing the warning bell, and he's getting ever more sort of hysterical almost in his rhetoric, and it feels like nobody's listening to him. So the UN, anyway, as a body, it has a purpose.
Well, I have to say we have very similar views, because if you think about it, COP is the only time 196 countries get together and have the same voice. Okay, all countries have a voice. They're all in the negotiations. That doesn't happen at the G7. It doesn't happen at the G20. It doesn't have the G20 plus. Okay, so this is the only time that at least once a year they all get together. They're all in the same place. And okay, some have hundreds of delegates and some have 3, but they're all in the dialogue. And for 30 years, we've had this dialogue, and the conversations aren't just about climate change. They are all about the environment, they're about the economy. You have countries of the South talking to each other in little groups, organising sort of like the next sort of African meeting, etc. So it's a way of actually getting those together. We have moved a long way. Paris was incredible, but that's amazing that the French were able to organise that along with civil society and the least developed countries, and were able to get people to agree to something. But that's almost like us saying, yes, okay, we're all going to agree, aren't we? We're going to go, next year we're going to run a marathon, aren't we? Yeah, come on. And I could probably persuade you, blackmail you, and sort of like show you pictures, and you will say, yes, we'll go run a marathon. But then we actually have to do all the stuff to actually do it. And so that's why Glasgow was so hard, which is implementation is hard. And I'll go back to one of the key things. I'm not convinced that it is necessarily capitalism that is to blame, but it's actually the failure of the Westphalian states. The reason being is if we look at the largest, say, oil and coal companies, 19 out of the largest 25 are state or partly state-owned, okay? So they're getting the US petrochemical dollar, you know, so they're getting all this. And the subsidies that you mentioned, that's $500 billion of taxpayers' money per year being given to these fossil fuel companies to pollute our atmosphere. And so therefore, it is really incumbent on the UN, and particularly this process, to put pressures on those countries to actually stop doing that, stop subsidizing. And this, for me, one of the things that no one seemed to really get excited about except me, because I'm a bit of a geek. In the Glasgow Climate Pact, it says we should get rid of fossil fuel subsidies, and also we should phase down coal. Now, that sounds really sensible. Fossil fuels have never been mentioned in a climate agreement ever. Okay, this is the first time that countries like India and China just went, yeah, okay, mention it. Yeah, everybody knows it anyway. And the only thing they did was say, instead of phase out, phase down coal. And our press here, I was mortified, deeply racist, going, oh my God, India is trying to wreck the... And it's like, hang on. In the other corner, there's John Kerry, the Brits, and the EU going, yeah, no, we're not going to do lots of damage.
You must,
and China,
China played a very big role.
Yeah,
I think.
saying we're not going to do loss and damage because we don't want to pay people money for the damage we've caused.
Clover, 30 years, and probably more than you've been alive. 23, right. So, probably for as long as you can remember, you've been hearing about it. What do you think? Should they just walk out? Or should there be more young delegates in the room, perhaps? Mark referred to some of his students were in delegations last year, master's students. What's the answer? It's your turn.
Good question. Oh, God.
No.
Let's just pass on the baton of hope to the next generation. First, I do want to challenge your comment.
It's the thing that upsets Greta the most is when people she says, I'm just a teenager. What about you lot? What are you doing? Yeah.
This is true. I did want to challenge your comment around capitalism. I agree that capitalism wouldn't inherently be a bad thing if the metric was, I want to be a billionaire, and by that I mean I want to make sure 1 billion people live great lives, but unfortunately the current system is one that's built off the back of colonization and disproportionately advantaging a very small number of people. However, around the COP process, I mean, I don't think at all it's, let's throw out the baby with the bathwater, and obviously COP, as Farhana has highlighted, has delivered so much. But again, I think we're always grappling for a silver bullet solution, whether it's the COP process or a certain type of solution or a certain company, whatever. And I think at this point in time, when reports are coming out and saying that there is no viable path to limit to 1.5 degrees, and to that point, I would love us to stop framing 1.5 degrees as a goal, because 1.5 degrees is an absolute limit. We keep saying, oh, great, let's get to 1.5. It's like, no. Like, we're already living through the early stages of climate catastrophe right now, and it's only going to get worse. So challenging that framing, we need to think about, okay, well, what hasn't worked to date? And ultimately, I don't think the role of power has been centered enough in the conversation, right? And ultimately, the oppressors do not want to liberate the oppressed. That is true. That's true of every civil rights movement ever. Power, I interviewed Farhana a number of years ago. She very graciously agreed to come on my podcast. And, she said, power does not wish to disrupt itself, right? And so I think we need to stop looking to the people in historic seats of power and saying, yeah, how are you going to give up your privilege and influence, and how are you going to give over money, etc., to help the most vulnerable, unless they all simultaneously have an altruistic moral crisis and decide to completely have a lobotomy and change their entire approach to life. I don't think we're going to see change and action at the pace and scale required, and that's why I too am so passionate about people power and civil disobedience, and what are those disruption points, whether it is people leaving their organizations or it's people gluing themselves to buildings. What is going to grind this current economy to a halt, to the point where we can bring in truly transformative solutions? As Farhana already highlighted, it's cheaper to produce renewables. However, the fossil fuel industry recognizes that it can keep extracting as much as possible within this current economic framework. So we need massive disruption, and I really invite everyone in this room to participate in exactly that.
Well, we've had some elections, actually, so there's a democratic demonstration in Australia, in Brazil. We've had a bit of, movement in governments where people are taking into account climate. Certainly in Australia, I felt embarrassed last year to be Australian at Glasgow, because we were there with the Russians and the Saudi Arabians in terms of carbon emissions. Nyando, I want to ask you, does the Stockholm Institute advocate sort of this democratic approach, as opposed to civil disobedience?
I think it's finding a balance of both. Depends on who you ask, really. I think it's finding a balance of both. As long as there's mutual respect on both parties, then it's a good way of tabling things on and discussing them. but I'm all for protests and all that. And I was reading these comments on Twitter when these activists were gluing themselves on the walls and throwing things at famous paintings. And I was appalled by some statements that people were making. Like, oh, do you think now this will get the attention of the people you're trying to reach? And I'm like, if you're writing this comment, then you've already got your attention. So I'm all for drastic actions that will shake people up. I mean, every day I come from work because my kids know that we moved to Stockholm in February. I'm originally from Kenya, and they were like, why are we moving away from Kenya to Stockholm? And I said, well, I got this really a good opportunity to work at the Stockholm Environment Institute. They're like, okay, finally, you can stop climate change. And I said, no, that kind of a hero. So every day I wake up, I look at my kids, and I don't know whether they realize how dire the situation is right now. Myself, I'm already scared that we might not have a planet to live in the next foreseeable future. So when I look at them, I'm like, first of all, I'm like, should we even have gotten kids? Like, do they even know the kind of future that awaits them? So and I tell them every day, you have to speak up. If you see someone doing something wrong, you have to speak up. So I'm all for activism and protesting and civil society. I back them up. But there's also room for, discussions on the table, which I think is the core of COP, of people coming together, negotiating and discussing and forging a way forward. So I think it's finding a balance of both. When it's just like parenting. When it's time for discipline, then we discipline. But when it's time to talk as friends, then we can talk as friends.
So
I really have to go. Sorry, I have to go parent now to my young generation of children.
Okay.
It has been really good
Thank you
being
much.
part of this panel. I've enjoyed the discussion, and I'm also learning a lot. And I all the best as you continue with this. Thank you.
Thank you, Nyanda. I feel like there's so many questions I haven't asked, but I am keen to know at this COP, do you think, Vahana, that a way of balancing this negotiation and protest, if you like, that, because last year I was impressed that every country got to get up and make a statement in the final plenary. That was really powerful. Some of those statements were extremely powerful. But I wonder, is there a point where a delegation, a country, just walks out of that room because there is no commitment on loss and damage, there's a backsliding? How do you make your point then as a nation if you're in COP, there in the plenary room?
Well, there have been COPs where no agreement was possible, and so there was a collapse, and there was COP6, actually, which was The Hague, which collapsed. Then Copenhagen collapsed and was sort of rescued with this sort of 3-page note because many delegations had threatened to walk out or refused to. And I think we're at the point where I think that that's a serious option, which the presidency has to really take notice of. The presidency, first and foremost, is the official in charge of deciding when to end, convene, continue, and produce a result that is satisfying.
So maybe if Alex
So I think
got on his feet with maybe G10, not the 20.
Yeah, I think what happened on that last night was very sad, actually, because I had to get my train back from Glasgow, so I was watching it live and on the phone. And I think it was awful what happened, and that it was a negotiation on the floor that left no choice to the vulnerable countries and the developing countries except to accept that deal, which was brokered. You could see it was older, white, mainly men. It was older men who made that deal. And the women were then left from AOCs, from LDCs, from others to say, we don't accept it, but we also don't have, frankly, instructions to walk out at this point because we've come here to agree all of the package. So I hope that doesn't happen again. I hope that developing countries are very much more resolved. They're very united as what we call the G77, even though there are countries like China, the Saudis, and, there is a recognition that this is a historic moment. And we never want to collapse something for the sake of it. I guess, look, the final thing is, for me, where is the balance? Where is the arc of our efforts going? There's the dismantling process that we've talked about, dismantling structures, mindsets, economic ways of thinking, including the financial sector, which is a huge part of that. And then there's the negotiations and the birthing of the new systems, the new ways of being. And right now I'm sort of much more focused on that, because people don't act out of fear. And what we know is that these movements that we talk about in the past, they really succeeded because people had a very positive vision of what to replace the bad stuff with. And right now we need a lot more of that to happen, so that people feel comfortable letting go of systems they know don't work. So I also use the word capitalism, but recently I've just started using the word business as usual. And the minute you say business as usual isn't working, everyone agrees. Everyone agrees. Whereas if you put capitalism, everyone's like, we don't want socialism, I'm not a socialist, I'm not a feminist, I'm not a green, whatever. So I think our vocabularies and the ways of communicating, and this is a quote from a young activist yesterday called Rosa Thorby, who was part of this Culture COP assembly that we had a couple of days ago, who said the ways of communicating must be as diverse as we are. And I think you can change the word communicating to mobilizing, to solutions, to imagining, must be as diverse as we are. And the current system isn't that diverse in any sense. It does not value huge parts of the planet. It does not value huge parts of nature. It does not value the contribution that young people might make in the future. It does not value the public sector. It does not value very much. So those value systems themselves must change. And I think we're all here discussing the negotiations, and negotiators do sometimes capture that. And I hope that they will in charm, actually.
Do you think, like previous movements, though, that you get to a point where just, before there's sort of a breakthrough, it meets sort of enormous resistance? So, for example, I see that the oil and gas companies are more prominent, in fact, in Egypt than they were in Glasgow. They seemed a bit shamefaced last year. This year, not so much. And it almost seems, looking ahead to the next COP at UAE, even more so, because it's such an oil and gas producing nation, and it goes for the, what do they call it, all of the above strategy, that you still need to have oil and gas. Clover, do you feel at all hopeful about not just the outcomes in 2 weeks' time, but the ones, for the next year?
I personally try to think about COP as little as possible. For me, kind of akin to what Farhana was saying, I've spent the past 10 years obsessing over why do people shut down in the face of the climate crisis, how do you motivate people to action, understanding the role of psychology and storytelling and culture. And, something that I've recognized in our own movement are, huge levels of burnout, a lot of activist infighting. You go to a climate conference and you're kind of bombarded with elevator pitches for, well, this is why my theory of change or solution is the most important. And I've been really thinking about this idea of, like, how do we embody and inhabit the world that we do want to create, right? And if we visualize the future that we want to inherit and it doesn't exist around us, how do we emulate that? How do we bring it into the present? And so, a lot of our work at Force of Nature has really been focused around creating those communities and thinking about community resilience. And we know that things are going to get a lot worse before they get better. That's just objectively what the science says. And so how do we create systems and culture that bring out the best in people, that bring out our innate tendency toward collaboration and community, rather than defaulting to the values that our current system promotes, like competition, consumption, comparison, etc. And so that's why we made a very intentional choice at Force of Nature not to go to COP this year, but to host climate cafes. And so we, not a new concept, but basically said we want to create safe spaces for people to come together and have conversations about the climate crisis and talk about what this means in our personal lives. And we want them to be very intergenerational, open to the public. Anyone can jump in. We have our flagship next week, actually, at the Natural History Museum, if anyone would like to swing on by, Tuesday to Friday. But we put this call out, and within 24 hours, we had 100 young people people sign up to host their own cafes around the world, now in over 30 countries, which is pretty cool.
Will there be one in Egypt?
Yeah. There'll be one here as well, actually, from one of our community members. And we've been actively fundraising to remove accessibility barriers so that young people can hold those spaces, so that there is an unpaid labor of activism, which is the implicit expectation at the moment. And so for us, that's really where all of our energy is going. You know, as Mark highlighted, you know, many of the decisions made at COP are already happening before and after the process, and I think we can get too fixated on, you know, well, the spotlight's shining on Egypt, but for me it's like, well, what are we doing to actually strengthen this tapestry of community, to come together, to talk about this as a human moral crisis, and to really, you know, invite that world that we want to create into the present.
Fantastic. I hope some of your cafe members run for office. I think that would be a great thing to do. I don't actually know what the time is, Freddie, so time for questions? Okay. Before we do that, one hope and one fear. I asked this of Jennifer Morgan, who was the head of Greenpeace, and now she's on the other side of the table working for Germany as the climate envoy. And as you may have read, Germany is extending the life of some of its nuclear plants only till April next year, but then also putting in gas storage and things to get through the next 6 months. So her fear was that these short-term measures to get through winter would become long-term measures. Her hope was, of course, that they wouldn't. So with that, one hope and one fear. Mark, I'll start with you.
Okay, so my one hope is that the realization that you cannot trust other countries when it comes to fossil fuel pricing will actually start to drive the world towards renewables in a much speedier way. Sounds really ridiculous that actually it's taken a war for EU to realize that they should have actually mobilized and moved to renewables much, much sooner. Now, short-termism, we know that in the US, they're now moving to oil and gas to be self-sufficient, but that's a short-termism, and you know that they'll then start to think about how to actually use that. What's 350 billion being put aside?
369.
Yeah, 369 billion, you know, I forgot the last 16 billion, you know, to actually get renewables up and running. So it's interesting. So my hope is that geopolitics and that sudden fear, particularly when you're a least developed country and you cannot afford for your prices to go up 3 or 4 times, that will drive there. My fear is that people will just go to the normal. We've seen this in this country. I mean, we had a prime minister that lasted a whole 44 days because even though she'd been trained in economics, she clearly hadn't read up in the last decade and decided that neoliberalism was a good idea, even though the International sort of Monetary Fund was going, no, don't do it. So again, I think we have a problem with too many people wanting to go back to what they feel were the amazing days of the 80s. They weren't.
Farhana, I'm going to let the next generation go last. So.
Good idea. Like, I guess at Paris, we decided that we'd send the signal out, and I think this was a group of NGOs and strategists in developing countries. There was this massive alliance behind the scene that was culminated in this thing called the High Ambition Coalition that sort of landed the deal. And we decided that we would say this was the end of the fossil fuels era, whatever language was in there, and that we would say that actually net zero by 2050 is the metric of the progression of mitigation combined with those 5-year targets. So my hope is this COP just ends this notion that business as usual is working, and some people still think it is, and it's okay. So I think this global realization that is really, really not okay is not something captured in a negotiating document. It's a sense, it's a message, it's the momentum that we need. So that's my hope, that's what we'll all work on from the inside outside and transmit that through all of the decisions, the pavilions, everything that we do. And I guess my fear is that that the leaders, especially Kerry and, you know, the USA, will just fail to deliver what they can deliver. And that will somehow drive a very downward spiral and a toxicity, and we'll actually end up with with nothing, another debacle, you know, like Hague, Copenhagen. I think we're due another one this decade, so there you go. That's
Well,
my fear.
maybe Mother Nature will hurry people along into a more positive conclusion than that, Clover.
I'll start with fear to end on a high note after
Okay,
that. So at COP last year, so as was mentioned, all of the countries have these different pavilions, and I couldn't find good coffee anywhere. And so I made a beeline to the Australia pavilion because I'm like, I know they're going to have an amazing cappuccino. And I rocked up only to learn that it was sponsored by one of Australia's largest oil and gas companies. So my fear is that that is what COP is going to look like again this year. There's already been pushback with the fact that Coca-Cola is one of the headline sponsors. When I went to COP21, I went to something called the Sustainable Innovation Forum. It was sponsored by Coke, BMW, Shell, and I remember snidely saying to a friend that it felt like going to a conference on lung cancer sponsored by Philip Morris, the cigarette company. So that is my fear, is that there will be blatant greenwashing, unapologetic greenwashing, and more empty promises scheduled far enough into the future that they require no immediate action. My hope, very simply, is that people call out that BS so that it doesn't happen again.
Very good note on which to end. Thank you. Freddie, am I still allowed to take questions?
Yeah, plenty of time for questions.
Okay, excellent. Who's first? The man with the lovely tie. I love that tie.
Thanks very much, Amelia, and great panel. Thanks. Ed Gemmell, leader of the Climate Party and managing director as Scientists Warning Europe. And when we talk about the COPs, I just have to say that it's so depressing. After I went to it to last year, I'm such a positive person. I think I was clinically depressed for 2 weeks afterwards when I came out of the COP. And I was disgusted on the last day. When you were on the train, I was actually listening to all this stuff, and I was absolutely, utterly disgusted by what we were doing and what we were taking out and hiding as well in the last draft. It became clear that we are absolutely never going to get international agreement that's going to keep us safe. It is rubbish. 26 attempts at doing it, we haven't got there. The first sign of madness, of course, is repeating the same thing and thinking a different option is going to come on the table, and it won't. It absolutely won't. So we've got to move on that. The next thing is and much as Paris was a move forward, the idea of net zero 2050 saving us, it won't, and we're still increasing emissions as we know at the moment, and Mark can correct me on this, as he'll know much better than I do. But roughly speaking, the IPCC's AR6 budget for keeping us safe in terms of carbon emissions for 1.5, which, as I agree, should be an absolute limit, runs out 2028. Okay, there's a few extensions on percentages. It's a load of rubbish. So what we've got to do, and now comes the action with Clover, where I commend all those people that take action. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'll be very quick.
Question.
The last little bit. Yeah, so the bit on the action is what can we do to get people moving forward on it? And I say that because I probably only got elected because of what XR was doing. Because people were saying, when I went and knocked doors, everyone went, I hate XR, and then talked to me for 20 minutes about their worries about climate, and then they went and voted for me. So what can we do to create that more creative action that actually moves things forward? Because currently at the moment, I'm unsure if what's happening in London is moving things forward.
Is XR the answer? Who wants to take that?
I would say more of us can be like Fahana. I think Fahana is such a, if you don't mind me saying, an incredible example of someone who has spent many, many years understanding the system and negotiating and being a bridge builder and making sure that those historically excluded are in the room. And then also, when frustrated at the limits of that system, gluing herself to Shell. I think it's so courageous and admirable, and I think that's exactly what more of us need to do. Is we need to lovingly hold people accountable, and we need to be outspoken, and we need to really draw on that courage, because ultimately we're still facing this climate crisis because we've gotten so good as a culture at sleepwalking, even as the science tells us we're hurtling toward this cliff of climate collapse. And so we need to stop the sleepwalking. We need to swim against the status quo, not just when it's uncomfortable, but especially when it's uncomfortable, whether that's at the dinner table or it's at work or it's in the classroom. Wherever we have a sphere of influence, we need to be incredibly outspoken. And the other thing I would say is that, a lot of apocalyptic headline news stories, particularly when we hear numbers like 33 million people, it's really hard to like grapple that. And it's easy to kind of switch off from it because it maybe doesn't relate to our direct lived experience, particularly if we are in a bubble of relative climate privilege. And so that's why storytelling is so important. And when people are experiencing the squeeze of the energy crisis here in the UK, of the cost of living crisis, we need to understand that that is a product of a fossil fuel economy. So we need to join those dots. We need to make it relevant to people's lives. And like the people I'm joined on this panel with, we need to be more courageous. Love and rage, as my friend Deza Gaji likes to say.
Please, over here at the front.
It's a really quick question. Just you mentioned renewables. I think it's a very easy thing that people sort of bring into the conversation. I live in a place where I live in Orkney, where renewables is the sort of the key word for everything. Everything's going into sea, harnessing the power of the sea, wind turbines, everything. You know, we're in the windiest part of the British Isles. And it's ruining everything. People aren't talking to the fishermen, people who are interested in birds. It ruins our society, you know. It's the whole ecology. You know, you think it's the sort of sticking plaster for everything, but if you alter the tide, it alters the small fish that the puffins feed off, the things that the other fish birds feed off. No one's talking to the sort of fishermen and the people that actually live in these places, that they're sticking all these renewables. And I love the idea that it's going to solve everything, but it then alters the whole ecology of the planet. And I worry that we're not looking into that.
So, Mark, the balance between climate collapse is the the other alternative.
So I'm going to answer this in a gentle way. The one thing you have to be very careful of is climate deniers have been very good at trying to sort of dissuade you that renewables are bad. You know, they kill birds. I remember Kevin Anderson having an incredible conversation and said he used to work on an oil platform, okay, and they were flaring. The number of seabirds that just, he said they got through thousands of birds burnt to death every single day. But we don't talk about that because that's already existing. So I think we have to be very careful. Think about the huge oil slicks in Nigeria. Think about the flaring. Think about the air pollution. So fossil fuel air pollution kills prematurely 10 million people per year. We only got through 2 million through COVID, and we shut down the whole planet due to that. No, I'm saying that you have to be, firstly, fossil fuels, really environmentally bad. You wouldn't want them anyway. Now you're saying, well, how about renewables? Well, actually, renewables do have issues, but actually you can modify them. So, for example, if you put wind turbines up and you put them really large and big, if you paint one of the actual sort of wings black, birds don't hit it. So it's then doing the research to make sure that you have that dialogue.
It's more to do with the sea.
Well, the sea, again, I would say tidal stuff, if you put it in the right place, will have very little effect on sort of like shallow sort of marine environments. You'll have the research. So I would say that I would agree with you that the research should be done and should be there. But again, it's not saying, what you're saying is, well, actually, I don't want that because it might be a bit damaging compared with all of the damage done over here, which I find problematic. I also have this problematic thing about sort of like wind turbines, because there's so many wind turbines that turn down. Why? Because people are owning second houses and they don't want their lovely landscape ruined by wind turbines. If you go and talk to the real locals, they go, I'm a farmer, extra cash, absolutely, because I'm struggling. So again, you have to be very careful.
The electricity is going back to France. It's not even owned by those communities.
There's,
hang on, so now you're onto a different thing. You were dissing renewables, And now you're saying it's not going to the community because of the economic system. Now, I agree. Dialogues have to be occurred. I would say, actually, to answer your question, sir, actually, we shouldn't be just talking about the climate crisis. We should be talking about our social crisis. Why is there a problem? Why do we have food banks in this country? Why do we have extreme poverty in this country? Why do we have it in developed countries? Because we haven't had that conversation. Again, when we come to, say, talking about capitalism, in the 1970s, Richard Nixon came this close to putting in universal basic income in the United States, okay? Because that wasn't socialism, because that was Russia, okay? So actually supporting your people was acceptable, but we've moved so far from that that's no longer acceptable. I think there's some much bigger issues we have to deal with, which then lead into why are we using so much energy? Why are we consuming so much?
There are some systemic issues. In fact, I've heard Mr. Octopus, Greg Jackson is his name, CEO of Octopus, who says that, as you say, wind turbines are producing cheap electricity, but the electricity in Scotland is being sent further south more cheaply, and he's advocating that communities own their turbine and they get the benefit of the cheap electricity. And then what the excess, because they're small communities, would go further south. So I think there's solutions, is I guess what I'm trying to introduce for Hannah.
I was going to make the same point, actually. There's loads of innovative community energy schemes, and some of them are not happening, whether they're solar panels or small-scale turbines, because the local grids don't allow for that. So can we not have just a dialogue? Can I answer your question? Because you seem, to be moving all the goalposts against every solution. And I think actually all of these reports establish there are thousands of solutions. It wasn't just that there's no pathway. It was also, the message was, there are thousands of solutions that are cheap, adaptable, and can solve so many other problems. I do have sympathy with local ecological impacts, and they affect everything. They don't just apply to renewables, they don't apply to everything. And I think the thing that we have maybe overly focused on in the whole of this session is fossil fuels, whereas land use and agriculture are a huge source of toxicity to those rivers, to the seas and everything. The fish are dying, frankly, not because of the turbines or the wind, and the tidal schemes. They're dying because of acidification worldwide, and they're dying because of algal blooms, and they're dying because of nitrogen, and they're dying because of the agricultural system that we have, which is based on fossil fuels. It's based on fossil fuels. It's another way in which our system is tied up with it. And that's what I would love to have a serious and longer and maybe a different conversation at the Conduit about, and recommend one of my sort of local heroes, and George Monbiot's book Regenesis is absolutely brilliant about how we can free up lots of land, and land needs to return to nature, land needs to return to other things. The way in which we grow our food is very, very toxic. Land needs to generate energy, and we can do that very well, even in a small country like the UK, which is heavily populated. So I just wanted to say that there are lots and lots of things going on where we need to rip up our rules on local planning, the way in which we assess, micro projects. I live in London in a very leafy part of, obviously, I'm one of those Guardian reading, woke, tofu reading, eating literati, whatever. So actually, the discussion in our street is a whole bunch of people want to install air source pumps, and we can't, because the planning rules, which are essentially prioritising aesthetics, will not allow it. So that is one of the questions why these protesters, they're highlighting, do you really, at this time in human history, we're on the verge of ecological collapse, prioritise aesthetic and art? And, that is the bigger question that they've asked. And we don't have to agree with that, but that is what I feel needs to be outed as the discussion. What do we let go of? Do we let go of some of our aesthetics at this point? I think so. That's what happened in, every emergency that happened. We did a lot in COVID. We did a lot in all of these emergencies that happened. And I think we need to move to that emergency mentality ourselves of what are we letting go of. And then just one final thing, an activist friend of mine, I'm sorry, I've forgotten the name of, what are we pretending not to know? That's what is a real important question. There's so many things that we just pretend we don't know as we walk through life, as we go through the negotiations, as we want to pretend a lot. And that's really what we need to stop asking ourselves. I think you're pretending not to know all of the bad effects of the fossil fuel industry and its infrastructure and the pipelines and the gas and all the rest of it. And they are huge compared locally on the impacted communities. That's why they're all out there protesting. Gas, oil infrastructure is hugely polluting, damages the health, lungs, asthma, you name it, in every country that is the same. And that is not the case for renewables. There are specific issues, nearly all of which are solvable. Sorry, I had to butt in on that.
Thank you for your question, because I think this demonstrates the value of having a COP, actually, or having discussion. Yes.
Just got. Should we have two questions?
Two questions, and then we'll wrap up. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Mary Mofrace. I'm part of the movement of cities in transition from Rob Hopkins in Marseille. And tonight we've heard a lot about the lack of confidence between countries. We've talked about a lot about colonization, the fact of extracting primary resources. And we haven't talked about a group of countries who share the same culture, who are part of the same historical process, who share as well the same economical background, and these countries are from the Commonwealth. They are all around the world. They are among the countries who have the most impact in the world, and I'm asking myself, what actions are taken within the Commonwealth to push a transition, a shift? Because if we had Canada, Great Britain, Australia, India, Egypt taking their responsibilities, talking to each other and saying, just ourselves, we're going to try to do something, maybe this might have a shift. And it might as well then put more pressure on the United States and on John Kerry, and put more pressure on China, with whom the Great Britain had a lot of, as well, historical interactions during the 17th century. So I'd like to know about that.
Can you take that? The Commonwealth countries, can they get together? I mean, speaking as someone from a Commonwealth country, it only just joined the party through an election process less than a year ago, so it would have had a hard time being at that table.
So the Commonwealth heads of state, called CHOGM, do meet every couple of years. And in many of those meetings, they've adopted a declaration that has been very directly influential. So the CHOGM that was held in Malta just a week ago, before the Paris meeting, was really influential. I'll tell you how influential it was. I had it printed out and I gave it to the American delegation and said, look, the CHOGM heads of state have agreed 1.5, and they're asking for this, this, and this. So at times it's hugely helpful on loss and damage at that particular COP, and I wish that CHOGM, is an important. That's just the acronym. The heads of
the CHOGM includes the colonised as well as the.
Well, it does, but it depends on how, for example, they accept and want to stay in the Commonwealth, and how active they want to speak as a group. And there are a lot of questions, I think, that have been raised with the passing of, Queen Elizabeth, and whether they will accept or really pay that much attention anymore. And many of them are considering leaving, or at least not having their King Charles as their head of state. So it's an important grouping, but I personally think it's based on some flawed logic, and it's time to challenge all these flawed logics. Really. Yeah.
So challenge the status quo. Final question.
Yes, I wanted to ask you about the loss and damage question. And of course, from what I've understood, this year is really, you're going to be pushing for the countries who've suffered harm to be compensated. What about when those countries are governed by regimes that do not have good human rights records? How do we ensure that the funds, if we can get them released to these vulnerable people, get into the right hands? Should there be conditionality? is that a bad look for, the countries who've caused the harm with their development to then make, demands? But how do we ensure that it goes to the right people, and should it be funding regimes that have horrible human rights records?
Who wants to take that? Clover, do you want to have a go at that, or no?
You have probably a technical answer to this. I would just say, speaking from someone who works in the nonprofit kind of like charity sector, there's a lot of like modern day colonialism in our thinking in terms of like, we'll only give you this funding on this basis and you must use it in this way. And I mean, what like report after report has shown is generally when you empower people at the grassroots, they find the solutions that are most effective for them. So it is just about releasing the funds, but that's very much from an NGO kind of civil society perspective.
It's a very live debate at the moment because of the South African package that's being negotiated. There's 8.5 billion for South Africa to shift from coal, which I think we wrote about today from the perspective of the coal miners, actually. Farhana.
Sure. I mean, that's a question that's often raised with aid, government official aid, as well as the money that individual gives to charities that are working on a humanitarian basis. And in some cases, yes, that money gets misspent or doesn't get as efficiently to the people who need it. But that's true of all financial transactions. There's fraud, there's malfeasance, but it's quite small and it's containable and it's not part of the bigger problem. The bigger problem is there's just been a diminishing of aid. And for example, in the UK, there was a report that came out a day or two ago that actually half of what we say is our aid is now currently being spent on dealing with Ukraine, and it's been securitized, it's been dealing with refugees, migration, and all those other issues. So I think, in all honesty though, I think this is where real creativity is also needed. And the initiative that I'm actually working most of my time on is the Climate Justice and Just Transition Donor Collaborative. And we're looking at how re-granters work, like who can nimbly get money to communities on the front line. And often they cannot absorb such large amounts of money, they don't have websites, and we're looking at how, for example, philanthropy, but also other mechanisms that use money can be based on trust and be nimble and be based on this participatory approach. And I think that's also the pioneering approach of some of the financial mechanisms that the UNFCCC established. Sorry, I'm going back into acronyms. So there are these funds that give out, for example, 50,000, which is the Global Environment Facility. So there's all this innovation that's been done, actually, and this is an excuse, again, to not then scale up and trust those mechanisms to do more.
But there will be this ongoing debate about grants, whether you just give the money or whether you have loans with
to the debt crisis,
add to the debt problem with injurious interest rates and so on. So I think it is very live and interesting. I'm fascinated by that because it applies actually in developed countries as well. So in America, how do you buy coal miners out of their jobs essentially, and then what do they do? I think we've had a great. We could keep going for another hour, but maybe it will have to be time for another panel discussion. Thank you all for coming. Freddie, any other instructions I have to?
Well, before asking everyone to join me in thanking all of you, just to mention that we will be having cocktails upstairs in place of our member mix-up, so do head upstairs shortly and use this as a catalyst for more conversation amongst yourselves. And I think some of you guys may be joining us if you can. But thank you sincerely for being with us. Just to plug a few events that are coming up, we've got an event with Climate Curious Live on the 14th of November. We'll be hosting a climate cafe with Force of Nature on the same day. We have a COP27 sort of kick-off Ubuntu dinner on Monday. Places are still available. We'll be doing a kind of post-COP roundup session on the 18th of November. Again, will be on that panel amongst several other great voices. So look out for that. Everyone will get an email about that. Then on the 30th of November, UK nature restoration is in focus. Just picking up on your point, Farhana, with the National Trust. We've got some colleagues with us this evening from the National Trust who are doing amazing work in that area of biodiversity and nature restoration in the UK, so look out for that. It will be with Tony Juniper of Natural England, amongst others. So sincerely, thank you, Amelia, Fahana, Mark, Clover, and Nahende for a tremendous primer before COP27. And do join us upstairs for a drink, but before that, join me in a huge round of applause by way of
Thank
gratitude
you.
to our speakers.
Thank you.